Hello, Royal History Geeks. Good evening. I say good evening, that's because I'm recording it of an evening. Of course, you might be watching it at any time of day or night. So good hour, whatever hour it is, where you are and when you are watching this. We're back with another video, but the exciting development is I now have my very own Royal History Geeks t-shirt. Can you see? It says with me. Stand up. See? Royal History Geeks. Can't really see that. That was a birthday present from some friends of mine, Jason and Sasha. Thank you very much for that, and I hope it adds a certain flair to tonight's proceedings. So we've had quite a few chats about some important issues recently, and I've decided to be brave, or foolish, up for debate, and tackle one of the biggest subjects, which is who killed the princes in the tower, if indeed they died at all. I actually opened my blog a few years ago now with a series about Richard III and the Princess in the Tower, but the videos I did were all really just intros to the blog, so I thought it was worth me distilling my thinking into one video. I was going to say one short video, it probably won't end up being that short, but they don't generally tend to put across my point of view and to encourage you all to join the conversation. Before we get going, I just want to say that I know this is a subject which gets people going on one side or the other. I do not approach this from a partisan way. It is clear that I have a very specific view, which will, if you don't already know, but it will become clear probably within the next minute or two. But I'm always open to changing my mind if new evidence emerges. I am not wedded to any particular view on this. I've got no vested interest in this, and I would encourage everyone to come to this discussion from the same spirit. That said, I should probably make clear now that I am relatively confident, and believe that we can be relatively confident, that Richard III did kill the princes in the Tower in 1483. And if you're perhaps not of that persuasion and don't enjoy a good debate on this particular issue, I will not be offended if you click away now, and I'll be able to see if people do, because you can see from the analytics at what point people stop watching the video. But do feel free to click around now, because sometimes people are in the mood for debate, and sometimes people are like, you know what, I just don't want to hear this right now. So do click away if that's not you. But if you do disagree, by all means, I encourage you to post comments in the section afterwards, to join the discussion on Facebook or even on the blog itself. But let's keep it kind, let's keep it respectful, let's keep it good-humoured. We're talking about serious things, I fully accept that. We're talking about potentially the death and murder of two innocent young boys, and of course it is absolutely right that the conversation is dealt with in the seriousness that entails. But we must remember that we don't know the people involved. We are not friends with Richard III, we're not friends with Henry VII, we're not friends with Margaret Beaufort. We're just trying to do our best to study them as objectively as we can with historical figures, recognising they're real people that did live, and as such we want to be as fair and as broad-minded as we can, and to weigh the available source material as accurately as we can. So let's start doing that. So in 1483, King Edward IV, the great victor of the House of York, died. He'd been an incredibly successful king, with the exception of a brief hiatus in 1470. He'd been king since 1460. He'd taken over from a very good but very unable man, Henry VI. England had fallen apart under Henry VI's watch. Edward IV had won the crown in battle. He'd won it for the House of York in 1461 at the Battle of Towton, and since he restored order to England, and he'd ruled courageously, he ruled rather ruthlessly, but he had brought order back to the realm. However, whenever the crown of a usurping dynasty descends to the heir for the first time, it's an incredibly unstable period, and we can see that in all kinds of different royal houses throughout history. And for Edward IV, when he died, he was only 40. He was a few weeks shy of his 41st birthday. His death was unexpected. He hadn't been ill until quite recently, until the point of his death, although he did not live healthily, and 40 was not unduly old to expect to to live in those days. But he left the crown to his son, another Edward, who was due to become Edward V, who was only 12 years old. Not many years away from an age where he would be expected to take up personal rule of England on his own back. His father had only been 19 when he became king, and people had taken the reins of control. Not too much older than 12, but nonetheless too young to reign at that point, and therefore vulnerable to a period of instability. England was vulnerable to a period of instability. For reasons we're not 100% clear of, there's an initial grab for power over the young boy king between his maternal family, Queen Elizabeth Woodville, as she's generally known in history, and her relations, and his paternal uncle, Richard of Gloucester, Richard the Duke of Gloucester, who probably has the best right to claim to be regent of England, or protector of England was the phrase they used, in the initial months and potentially years of Edward V's reign. So, we're often told that this period in time, the 1480s, have a dearth of source material, that there's not an awful lot we have access to help us stitch together the events that happened. To an extent, that is true. The great art of chronicling had effectively started to die out by the invention of the printing press, but the things that would later come on board in terms of vigorous record-taking in the Tudor period have yet to take effect. So there's much less we have to draw on from previous reigns. That said, we can be relatively confident about what happened in those immediate months in 1483, and I would like to go one stage further and say, as a result, we actually can be broadly confident in our assessment of what happened to the princes in the Tower. We cannot be certain, and that's absolutely true. If anyone tells you they're 100% certain on the fate of the princes in the Tower, don't take them too seriously, because they can't really be telling you the truth. However, I believe we can be broadly confident that they were killed in the Tower under the orders of King Richard III, their uncle. And I'm going to set out why I believe that. We're often told that Richard's reputation was blackened by his Tudor successors. I understand that argument, and I understand that the people writing in the Tudor era would want to have been putting forward a narrative that was at very least not going to be offensive to the ruling dynasty, if not proactively sympathetic to the ruling dynasty. But that doesn't mean we can't trust anything that comes out in the Tudor period. And actually, as we go on in this conversation, I'm going to draw in some of those Tudor sources and explain why I think they make a valuable contribution to this debate. But I know a lot of people will not accept that. And as we don't have time to go into the reasons why I think we should take some of the Tudor sources seriously now, what I want to argue is that just by looking at source material from Richard's own reign, we can make a reasonably confident assessment of what happened. And I'll tell you why. There are two sources that we should give particular attention to. One is the writings of, not this chap, that's about a whole different era altogether. The writings of this chap. Dominic Mancini was visiting, he was an Italian, visiting England at this time, and he has written an account of what he calls the usurpation of Richard II, which he was sending to somebody outside of England. This is a very important account, partly because he's slightly removed from proceedings. He doesn't have any particular vested interest in the power play dynamics within England. He's a visitor, he knows he's not going to be there for any particularly long period of time, and he's writing to someone who he has no particular reason to play into a political agenda to when he's putting his words together. He clearly has access to some information at court, and he also knows what's going on around him and what people are saying. So he very much gives you the street version with some supplemented information of what was happening in 1483. Another important account is this, which is, and this is actually the whole of the Croyland Chronicle, although it's the third edition of it that we will pay particular attention to in our conversation. And that is technically anonymous, but was written almost certainly by somebody who was central in Richard III's administration and may have been as a significant holder of an office of state. So there, whereas Mancini gives you the street view, Croyland gives you the view from someone who knew more about what's happening, was more of a political insider, not one of Richard's closest or nearest and dearest, but someone that had that court and government perspective. Now, Croyland was written in the first few months of Henry VII's reign, so technically speaking, it's not contemporaneous to Richard's reign. It was written in the very earliest years of Tudor government. However, it was written so early that it's very unlikely that any Tudor propaganda operation is going to particularly have taken effect. And more importantly, B, it contains things that Henry VII, Henry Tudor, would not have wanted preserved. And actually that's probably the reason that Croyland actually ends up being destroyed and isn't rediscovered for over 100 years. So the arguments that he'll be writing anything to appease Henry VII don't really hold water. There is plenty in there that neither Henry VII or his wife Elizabeth of York would have wanted to see, would have wanted to preserve, would have wanted to go down to posterity. So these sources are free from claims of Tudor propaganda, and crucially, they could never have seen each other. Both only came to light much after the events took place. With the Croyland Chronicle, it was, and someone will no doubt know the precise timeline, which perhaps I should have researched, but it was well over 100 years before that account resurfaced and came back into popular currency. Mancini was discovered in a continental library much more recently, actually in the 20th century. So it's highly unlikely, perhaps impossible, that those accounts ever saw each other, yet the core events are the same. The chronology is the same, and the key events that we're going to talk about are the same. That gives us a high degree of certainty, before we ever get to a Tudor writer, a high degree of certainty that the events did take place. So what we know, the facts, what we know is that pretty much as soon as Richard knew his brother was dead, he rode to intercept the people who had the future King Edward V, the Prince of Wales. You can argue whether he was still Prince of Wales or whether he was king. That's a constitutional point that doesn't massively matter for our conversation, and took him into his custody. We then know that the young king's mother, Elizabeth Woodville, fled into sanctuary with her younger son and only other royal son, Richard, Duke of York. And we then know that Richard acted to get hold of Richard, Duke of York, and put both boys in the Tower. Once he had both boys in his possession, he then decided that actually he should be King of England himself. If you want to take a sympathetic view to Richard, you could argue that he did so under pressure from the realm, the three estates of the realm, because new evidence had come to light to prove that the boys weren't legitimate, therefore they weren't princes, therefore they couldn't inherit the throne, because it turns out their parents, King Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, had never been legally married. We're not going to get into that argument because it's actually not pivotal to the question of whether or not Richard had the boys put to death, although perhaps it's informative as to what was going through people's minds. It's a whole other subject. I think we should explore that in a different post, in a different video, but actually there is already stuff about it on my blog if you do want to check it out. But let's not have that conversation now. So we know that once both his boys are in his custody, Richard has himself declared king as Richard III. Then the boys are still alive. They are seen. They are seen playing in the garden. There's actually a third source from Richard's reign that tells us that. They're seen playing. Then we know that men rose up in the boys' favour. Men from the west, men loyal to Edward IV's regime, rose up and attempted to free them. It failed. After that, we know that the boys were drawn deeper and deeper into the tower. All their personal servants and attendants were dismissed, and they were guarded only by Richard's closest men. We then know that the boys were never seen again. Those are undisputable facts that we have different sources for contemporaries to Richard's reign that give us that information. That is not proof. The only evidence that Richard had them put to death is circumstantial. However, circumstantial though it might be, it's pretty overwhelming when you start to think through what the other alternatives were. So first of all, let's explore, were the boys dead at all? There's no evidence that they were. We're probably not going to talk too much about the bodies that were later found in the tower, because actually we don't know, we don't have DNA testing, we don't know whether they were the princes or not. But there are theories that the boys were not put to death at all, or certainly not put to death in 1483. But the problem with that is Richard knew that people thought he killed the princes. People were rebelling against him because he fought the princes. There was an alliance in support of Henry Tudor, Henry of Richmond, who would become Henry VII, who was the best Lancastrian claimant, who was the rival house to the House of York. An alliance between him and supporters of Edward IV that were all gearing up to put Henry and Elizabeth of York, sister of the princes, on the throne. That was an alliance arguably of quite questionable bedfellows. Had Richard produced the princes, he would have split that alliance down the middle and he would have saved his throne. He would not have died on Bosworth Field, and he would have been King of England for longer. So therefore, it seems highly improbable that the boys had survived, because producing them would have saved Richard's reign. So, if they're not alive, who could have killed them? Again, we know they're in Richard's high security prison, guarded only by Richard's closest and most trusted confidants. Therefore, it seems hugely unlikely, possibly impossible, although nothing's ever quite impossible, that these boys could have been put to death under the orders of anybody but Richard. The only possible exception might be if they were put to death under the orders of somebody who Richard's most loyal men thought Richard had dispatched, even if Richard hadn't. But if that were the case, Richard would have found out about that. He would have known about that. These were his most loyal attendants guarding them. Therefore, Richard would have taken that opportunity to expose whoever it was who'd given the false murders, which would have been a coup for Richard. The boys would have been dead, but he'd have someone else to blame. He could then unite the kingdom behind him. But he doesn't. Nothing is ever said about it again. So the overwhelming conclusion, there is also the argument that the boys died of natural causes, and it does look as if one of them may have been ill with a toothache, and who knows what that could have been a wider condition of. However, realistically, the chances that both boys died of natural causes just seems far too convenient, and again it would seem odd that Richard did not take advantage of that and publicise that, because that too would have been a great opportunity for him to have these rivals out the way, but at the same time to show that he was innocent and to unite people behind him. Perhaps in that scenario he would have been worried that people just wouldn't have believed him, so best to say nothing. So when you hang all that together, the most recognising that he had them in his possession, he had reason to want them out of the way. The fact that people were rebelling in their favour shows that people had not believed that they were illegitimate, that their supporters were still keen to put them on the throne of England, or one of them on the throne of England. Therefore he had the motive. He clearly had the means, he clearly had the opportunity. And if anybody else had somehow gained access to them, he would have heard about it and had those people put to death and exposed them for their crime, creating a perfect situation for him. If the boys had still been alive, he would have produced them to quell rebellion against him and to save his own throne. That in and of itself, I think, gives us a fairly high degree of confidence that the boys died under the orders of Richard III. As I said, I know that people do not trust many people Tudor sources about what could have happened to the princes, and I know that that's not an argument I'm going to win in the here and now, but I would just say this. Some years after, in about 1515, Thomas More, one of the most learned, respected humanist scholars of his generation, if not of all time, chose to make it his business to research what had happened to the princes and to write an account. Sadly for history, he never finished that account. He probably never intended it for publication. It was just probably for circulation among a few friends, for intellectual interest. That's the kind of man that More was. And in that, he describes how a close associate of Richard's, James Tyrrell, was given orders to kill the princes, and that he carried out those orders in 1483. Many people dismiss that as Tudor propaganda, and like I said, I don't think I'm going to win that battle in the here and now. But again, I will just say a few things about that. The first is there is external evidence to support much of what More says. He could never have seen the two sources I referenced earlier, which were the Croyland Chronicle and which were Mancini. But yet much of it hangs together, much of it corroborates. It all seems to be based on fact. There are some that argue More was not trying to write fact at all, and certainly his account is written in the humanist style, which does give plenty of poetic license, and there's evidence of that in More's account. But if he wasn't trying to write fact, why is so much of it factually verifiable? The second thing is there is a very important reality. I'm not saying that, I'm still making the first point, aren't I? Not sure there is very defined points in my head on this, probably one splurge of point. But the other thing that's very important to say is that there is good evidence to suggest that James Tyrrell did make a meaningful confession about something sinister that he had done. James Tyrrell was actually fought in the Battle of Bosworth for Richard III, but was then forgiven by Henry VII, as most people were actually. There's a lot of talk about how Henry VII predated his reign so that he could punish everyone for fighting against him. He actually forgave almost everyone that fought against him. But James Tyrrell was forgiven. However, he did later rebel against Henry, and he sided with a rival Yorkist claimant. Eventually, however, he was brought to justice and sentenced to death for treason. Very strangely, which of course that ties in with what More said, we can verify that. More then says he made a confession before going to meet his maker. That was typical of people who were about to be put to death. They very much believed they were about to come face to face with Almighty God, so they wanted to get everything off their conscience that they could. However, for many years people didn't think there was much in that. They thought that More was just making that thing up, and how convenient. Or maybe someone else had made it up and More had heard it. However, Alison Weir, the historian who researched in the last few years a biography of Elizabeth of York, the sister of the Prince of the Tower and the first Tudor Queen, Henry VII's wife and queen, she found evidence from the Tower records that when during Tyrrell's case, during the proceedings under which he was tried and then executed, that King Henry VII, and more strangely even than that, Elizabeth of York, were present. Now that's odd. You don't really get the king coming just to watch someone being sentenced and executed. But why on earth would the Queen be there? It didn't make any sense whatsoever. So perhaps one logical explanation, I would argue the most logical, is that Tyrrell pleaded to be able to make his confession in front of perhaps the person still living he felt was most wronged by his actions, which was the sister of the princess in the Tower. We don't know. No doubt people will have many other colourful theories, but I think that's the most logical, and it backs up what More was saying about about the fact that Tyrrell made a confession, and that confession was about his involvement in the death of the princes of the Tower. And all of a sudden, More comes back into play. If More's account is more or less reliable, and it seems increasingly like it is, then I'm afraid we can be relatively confident that, tragic as it is, Richard III was responsible for the death of his nephews, the princes in the Tower. I think it's worth saying, I was going to make some other points about Tudor sources, but I don't think there's a great deal of point in doing that. Let's maybe have that conversation another time. I do just want really to end on this in a similar vein to where I started, that I genuinely do not believe that by believing what I believe, by making that assessment of the historical fact, it means you have to conclude that Richard III was a man of no value, of no moral fibre whatsoever, and that he was essentially the unreconstructed monster that comes down to us from Shakespeare. I do not believe that. I do not believe that the fact he did this crime, and heinous as it was, and it was, there can be no excuse. Whatever we say at the time, whatever we say at the period, there can be no excuse of someone ordering two boys to be put to death. But, savage as it was, that is what he had learnt people needed to do in order to keep the throne. His brother, Edward IV, had been savage to those that had a trace of Lancastrian blood, and he knew it had to be eliminated for him to be secure on his throne. Richard, no doubt, knew the same. It does not mean that Richard wouldn't have made a good king. It doesn't mean that Richard hadn't shown loyalty to his brother. It doesn't mean that Richard hadn't done good things. But he acted like a savage medieval king to preserve his inheritance. And I think there's good reason to suggest he did it reluctantly. He didn't do it straight away. I think he wanted to see whether the pre-contract story, the story whereby that was posed to suggest that his brother had not been legally married to Elizabeth Woodville, and as such their children weren't legitimate and able to claim the throne. There is good reason, I think, to think that Richard wanted to see if that would stick, and then the boys could stay alive. But when men started to rebel in favour of the princes, he knew that that would not wash. That the only alternative, perhaps he was talked into it by someone else, who knows, was to put those boys to death. And I think his reluctance to do that explains why he didn't go on a bloodbath. He didn't kill the children of his other elder brother, Clarence, who, by some reckoning, although possibly not legally, had a better claim to the throne than him. He didn't kill the daughters of Edward IV and Elizabeth York. I think by that stage he just simply couldn't have got away with that. But I'm sure he did so because he had no desire to make any of the killings that he had to. But nonetheless, I think that he did. Well, again, we shouldn't be partisan about this. It is true that I do think Henry VII was one of the best kings England ever had. I think he made some hugely important constitutional changes. I think he helped shape England in an altogether more favourable, stable direction. But that's not the reason I don't think he could have been responsible for the murder of the prince in the Tower. There are those that believe he came to England in 1485, found the princes alive and had them killed. It's not that I don't think he's capable of that. I just simply do not think it's credible to believe the boys were still alive, sadly, in 1485. Not that I don't think Henry VII couldn't have killed them, I just don't think that he did. Henry VII did create, in my view, although less bloodthirsty than the Yorkist kings in general, he did have his wife's cousin, Edward, Earl of Warwick, put to death. He was probably framed to make it look like he'd rebelled. This is many years after he'd taken the throne and ahead of Catherine of Aragon, his future daughter-in-law, coming to England. Her parents wanted security, that Henry VII's son Arthur's throne was safe, and therefore Henry knew he had to engineer a situation where it looked like Warwick had tried to escape from his imprisonment in the Tower. He'd never even been imprisoned in the Tower in the first place, and was killed. Warwick was probably what we would call today a vulnerable adult. He did not deserve that, and Henry VII did that. So I can still think that Henry VII did that one terrible thing, and still not believe that he was evil, and I must therefore extend the same courtesy to Richard III. So I'm not trying to be partisan, I'm just trying to share the facts as I understand.